Second chances. Chapter 3, Conflicted Emotions. Notes. William feels stirrings of emotions within him as he spends more time with his angel. Emotions he is not sure he even wants or wants to understand. Where will this lead them both? The days passed swiftly and William grew stronger each day till finally Becker decided that he could get out of bed and explore his new surroundings but a little. His throat had healed and yet his voice was still silenced. Try as he might, he could not speak. Becker was confused as to why, but she had been assured by the healers of her home that it might take more time for William's voice to return. It being a more mental thing than a physical one. Something that William did not take lightly or kindly to, as he was ever frustrated that he couldn't speak to the one he still thought of as an angel. In fact, he threw a temper tantrum after being examined by the healers and was told he would have to find his voice on his own. It had taken Becker almost an hour to calm him down, for he wasn't used to, nor seemed to like, being comforted when he was in a rage. Becker seemed to sense this and tried to reassure him to not rush. She understood him perfectly, and not just by hearing him in her head. She could read posture and body language well, and was learning his tics, so to speak. He wasn't an easy man to live with or take care of, but she had known that from the beginning. For she had been guarding him for most of his life. She knew the man he was, and the man he could be if only he would allow himself to be so. She was waiting for him, in the outer hall, after having told him that today he could get up, and they could go for a walk together if he desired. She had to smile at the excitement that had flared up over his features before he shut them down. He wasn't fooling her one bit though. Glancing up at hearing his bedroom door open, she turned and shoved off the wall on which she was leaning and smiled faintly at him, trying not to openly stare at him. But by the gods, he was handsome. Dressed in one of her people tunics, which was brown in colour with hints of red and green and yellow about the leather, with black pants and his hair done up in a ponytail and tied with a black bow. He looked like one of the gods from her old fairy tales. He seemed a bit awkward as he came towards her and gave a small hint of a smile while all the while looking as if he couldn't care less what he wore. His arrogance was something she was attracted to as well, but she would never say so. "Ready?" she asked as she reached out and fixed the collar of his tunic, nodding at him.
"I am. Where to first?"
His sea-green eyes met hers as he nodded in return. Instead of answering, she turned and walked down the long corridor, smirking when he had to swiftly take a few extra steps to catch up. She didn't want anything to spoil his instinctive reaction upon seeing her home for the first time. They reached a large wooden door at the end of the hall, and she opened it, stepping into the sunshine, moving to allow him to go first. Watching him keenly. The sun was bright and it hurt his eyes, making him squint at first, but once he got used to it, he had to blink a few times to make sure he was seeing what he was seeing. The surrounding land was breathtaking. He had never seen anything like it. Rolling hills that faded into the distance of colors of green, blues and grays. A gentle creek flowed nearby, was the source of the water he had heard while in his room. Flowers of many colors dotted the landscape, with trees soaring to the heavens with skies of endless blue. It was really too much for him to take in all at once. A poet wouldn't even have been able to describe the beauty in which he saw before him, and for a moment, all was still. Tearing his gaze from the land, he looked back at Rebecca, who seemed to be enjoying his reaction. She couldn't stop smirking at him.
"Your home is beyond beautiful, Rebecca."
A soft smirk crossed his face as he watched her. "You haven't seen anything yet," she replied as she headed towards the steps that led down into the open fields below. He quickly followed after her. She matched her pace with his, not wanting him to tire too quickly on his first day out, and they walked together in what would have been seen as a comfortable silence. With Becker acting as guide and explaining things, when in reality, Becker was doing her best to answer each question William asked her. He was full of curiosity about her home. The stop at the farriers had all but caught his attention, and he had many questions as to how the ironworkers did their job so well. How the horses were able to stand so still without bucking. He seemed very intrigued with the armory. His expression showing curiosity and delight before he realized Becker was watching him and schooled it off his face. He had turned away, but not before she had seen the small blush tinge his cheeks at displaying such open emotion. She had watched him walk through the rows upon rows of the weapons her father's men kept up and in good condition at all times, and had mentioned the fact that there were no guns of any kind in the army.
No, William. My people do not see the need for such a weapon. That is man's way, not ours.
She had answered gently as she could, trying to explain their, if not simplicity, way of life of her people, then the way things were done.
We take only what we need to survive, that and no more. When it comes to a war, we fight in the old way. Win or lose.
It was hard for her to explain as well, since she had never seen the need for such weapons that created such destruction. Yes, they had bows, arrows, even bombs of a kind, but that was used in wartime only, and not for everyday use as some humans had taken to using them. Even hunting was treated as a sacred act, and done with arrow and bow only. She saw it confused William, but he let it go and turned to admire the craftsmanship instead. She showed him the whole layout of her home from bakery, in which he rested a few moments to simply enjoy the scents that wafted around the room. So much so, that she had to giggle when he was offered a small slice of the chocolate bread the baker had been working on all morning, and William, looking surprised, tentatively took a small bite before literally inhaling it. It was simple things like this, when he let his hidden personality out. That baker knew that there was a man worth saving under his cold, hard exterior. William had really enjoyed the tanner and the winery, and Becker had to admit, it was the snob in him that had enjoyed such things in his time. Fancy clothes and a good wine was the mark of breeding where he had been from. Here, it was a given, for the wine ran free, and the tanner sold the most beautiful fabrics that all could enjoy. So much to see, to explore, Becker knew they could never see it all in one day, so she decided to take him to one last spot, that happened to be her favorite place of all. She led him to a small meadow that rested deep within the woods of the place she called home. William's surprise at what he had been staying in the past few weeks was hysterical to her. Every time he saw something new, it was made him look positively boyish, though he tried to remain his aloof and haughty self. Coming to a stop, she moved a few branches out of the way and allowed him to go first. It was atop a small mountain, easily accessible if you knew where it was. A hidden glade she usually came to recenter and to think. Peaceful, tranquil. It was high enough up the mountain that it had a spectacular view of the castle and surrounding areas, and the mountains beyond. Taking a seat in the cool, soft grass, she smirked up at William as if inviting him to join her. He readily complied and took a seat facing the cascading waterfall that fed the creek that wound its way down the meadow and past her home. Everything was so beautiful here, and Rebecca had been so generous and forthcoming, and yet, he still didn't really know who she was. That bothered him on some small level. While he was considered to be a great ladies' man back in his time, he had a feeling none of that would work on her, and strangely, as much as he hated to admit it, he felt something for this strange and beautiful woman. He didn't know what that meant yet, as things such as love and compassion hadn't really been part of his creed. A war was being fought within him, and he wasn't sure which way it would go yet. She noticed his silence, and allowed him it. Having promised that his private thoughts were still his own, and she would not go prying simply because she could. She tilted her head and looked at him out of the corner of her eye, subtly, and smiled. He was an odd one. Yet she liked him. Which was rare of her kind to like any but their own. Besides, he had been through so much that she knew he would need time to adjust, and trying to discover what these fleeting bouts of feeling within her meant, she knew, would not be a good idea at the moment. So they sat there, side by side, watching the sun crest over the nearby mountains, each lost to their own thoughts. It was he who broke first, turning from the view in which had taken his breath away, and turned to face Rebecca.
The place you have brought me to is beautiful, but I feel that you have not been 100% honest with me yet.
He ventured slowly, noting the falter of her smile, and felt badly for it.
What are you? You have healed me so quickly and so well, no medic of my time could have done better.
He tried for a compliment and felt a little awkward. That wasn't his style.
And you mentioned that you disobeyed when you saved me. Disobeyed who? I surely hope you will not be punished on my account. I would not want that, for you.
He seemed earnest in his words, and Becker tilted her head a moment, wondering how to answer. She couldn't give him everything he wanted to know, not now. Her path was set since she had made her choice, and he could no sooner change that than stop the sun from rising.
I am a Valkyrie, which is a hybrid of a Valkyrie and a human woman.
Becker replied as her eyes furrowed a bit.
My mother's name was Rear, and she was in a sense, the human version of a titan, if you will. A goddess forced to live life as a human. Which is probably why my father was not punished for stealing her away.
She paused and her eyes furrowed again, trying to explain. Glancing over at him, she saw that he was waiting for her to finish and she sighed.
William, I ask you to trust me.
She had to make him understand. Her path was just that, hers, for the moment. He could not help her nor walk it for her.
You are in trouble, aren't you?
He questioned her, the tone of his voice inside her mind took on that dominating ring that very nearly had her shiver. His eyes furrowed in anger as fire flickered within them.
Can you trust me enough that I will tell you what you need to know?
She asked softly. Waiting for what seemed like ages until he nodded, the look of anger fading from his features but not gone completely. He reached out and rested his hand lightly atop hers. His thumb running up and down the side of her hand, and it caused her skin to tingle in an odd way. She found that she didn't want him to stop, and so turned her hand into his, causing a hint of a smirk to ghost across his lips. They sat there like that for most of the day. Becca answering what questions she could, the atmosphere around them comfortable. But sitting and talking wasn't the only reason she had brought him up here. It was also to get to know him better.
My turn,
she said with a hint of a smile, nearly giggling again as William's eyes furrowed in puzzlement at her words.
I have watched you for most of your life, William. Tell me why a colonel in the British Army?
She asked, curious. He could have been so many other things, but that was the life his path seemed to take, and she was curious as to why. She noted that that might not have been the greatest first question when the walls went back up around him. She saw it in his eyes. The warmth faded suddenly, as if it had never been at all.
If you have watched, then you would know.
His response sharp, almost biting. He flickered his eyes back to hers and then actually sighed and gave her hand a light squeeze. She had meant no harm in her question, he knew this.
Forgive me, but it is not a topic I like to talk about. Honestly, I had no choice.
When it seemed he would not be more forthcoming, Becker nodded and changed the subject. For which, William was grateful.
Well, besides being good with horses, what other interests do you have?
Here she paused as a small smirk crossed her face.
I seem to remember you being good at painting at one point. Do you still indulge, or is that just a wayward habit? Course you were really good.
She had watched him grow up, after all, and though she wasn't always around, she had been there at the various important times in his life to try and guide him. When he discovered his talent for art had been such a time, though it hadn't exactly ended well, given that his father had berated him for it, and though she knew he could not hear nor sense her. She had tried to salvage any emotions he had had towards his gift. He really was very good.
No.
A smirk and a soft scoff escaped him as he turned to watch her.
Not since the night I tried to give my parents something that I had made and watched my father set it ablaze.
His words were harsh, but not directed at her. His eyes, though, seemed to be searching hers for something. Validation. Honesty. Even he didn't know what he was looking for and eventually looked away.
You should try again, William.
Becca ventured softly.
Honestly, you were really good, and here is a place where all gifts and talents are nurtured. It might help.
She trailed off, not wanting to cross that bridge yet. He was still a very guarded, angry man inside, and she was not ready to poke that side of him just yet, nor did she want him to think she was trying to fix him.
Right.
His scoff was silent this time, as he shook his head, till he stole a look at Becker out of the corner of his eye. She sat there, one leg folded against her chest, arm wrapped around it as she leaned against it, looking back at him and then out to the scenery before them. So peaceful. It made something inside him slip, just the tiniest bit. He could tell she meant what she had said. That she wasn't being patronizing or teasing him. It made him feel weird. This new feeling inside him, and he cleared his throat as he suddenly rolled his shoulders and turned to look back at the view around him with a sigh.
Maybe I will.
Becker smiled a soft hidden smile at William's words and unfolded herself from where she sat.
I don't know about you, but I could use a dip, and that lake looks inviting.
She stood almost gracefully and turned to head towards the small lake that sat in the center of the meadow. Slipping slowly out of her tunic and pants and discarding them as she went. She did still have on a small undergarment that covered her, but it left little to the imagination. Her people were not so modest as the humans of his time were, and it showed. Upon reaching the edge of the water, she stepped into it, hissing at its coolness before she all but plunged in, going under to get used to the chill. Upon surfacing, she laughed softly and turned that smile back upon William.
"You coming?"
she asked cheekily. William had never been one for swimming. In fact, he had never been near the water before. The one time he had ventured into open, deep water, he had drowned, and it was an experience he did not care to repeat. So when Becker spoke of such things, he couldn't help the cold chill that ran through him, nor the haughty remark that made its way into his head at her question to join.
I would rather not. I have no desire to get wet.
Becker giggled at that answer and spun about playfully in the deep water, making crystalline drops appear before settling once more.
"Oh, come on, William. It's fun."
She smirked over at him again before she caught the look he threw her and then paused, tilting her head a bit.
"You can swim, can't you?"
she ventured gently.
Of course I can. I just have no desire nor inclination to do so at this time.
He seemed to pout and huffed out loud, his face a mishmash of embarrassment and defiance.
Besides, silly pastime.
Becker saw right through his bravado at hearing his words and his body language. Making her way back to the shallows so she could stand, she walked slowly out of the lake and came to a stop before him. He refused to look at her and she smiled softly, holding out a hand to him.
"I will teach you then,"
she said softly, which made his head crane up to look at her. His eyes a frenzy of rage, defiance but also amusement. He wanted to defy her, but something in her calmness, he found himself reaching for her hand before he could stop himself and pulled himself up to stand beside her. Her smile radiant like the sun, he allowed himself to be led towards the lake's edge, where she stopped him and smirked again.
"Be hard to swim with your tunic getting wet, William."
She motioned to the heavy, deerskin shirt he wore and blinked before reaching for the buttons without hesitation. She stepping back to allow him space to undress as much as he deemed necessary. Only when he stood before her in his trousers, sign tunic, and boots, did he raise his eyebrow at her almost challengingly. She chuckled softly and reached for his hand once again and gave it a light squeeze.
"It's all right, William. I won't let you drown."
So saying, she led him slowly into the water. The only thing he could think about as he stepped into the cold, clear water was that he must be insane. Insane to allow himself to do this again, to attempt something he had sworn off for good. For what? For her. He hated the water, simply because he feared it, but with such a look of reassurance and understanding from his angel, he wanted to try again. Wanted to experience this with her, and that feeling and thought alone terrified him. He tried not to gasp at the chill of the water, for it was quite cold, but if she could do it, he could too, right? Grasping her hand tightly, he took another step, then another. His angel going at his pace and never seeming to rush him. It was only as the water reached waist height that he froze, seemed to panic and balk, causing Becker to look at him with such a look of understanding that it nearly undid him, in many ways. He was angry first, as that was the emotion he most understood. Why should she be so understanding of his fear? It was stupid. To be afraid of something so simple. Then he was angry with himself, for being afraid. It was a never-ending circle of anger, fear and resentment. Yanking his hand away, his chest feeling like it was in a vice, he strode away from Becker, back to the bank, and sat back in the grass far away from the water's edge, muttering in his head how he felt, and was so happy she couldn't hear him this time. Seeing his fear, before he hid it in his anger, Becker sighed softly and let William go, turning to follow only after he had settled himself in the grass and settling down beside him. They sat in silence a moment, his body language clearly stating to her that he didn't want to talk. His blue eyes snapped fire as he looked everywhere but at her.
"It's okay, William."
Her voice soft as she reached out a hand to lay lightly against his shoulder. He turned to look at her since she was sitting opposite of him, and she could see the conflicting emotions within them.
"We can always try again later."
Her soft voice was a bane to his internal fire, and he sighed and reached up to cover her hand with his own, while looking back over to the view of the sky, which had slowly started to fade into dusk. They stayed that way until night slowly descended upon them. Only when it began to get chilly, did they venture back to the castle. Later, in bed as sleep began to take hold, William knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he was in love with her. That both excited and frightened him, for he had never been truly in love before. Perhaps slow was best in these matters. Besides, he wanted to learn more about his angel and the place she called home.